All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Good morning. Let us begin. Sorry, still in the aftermath of some technical issues over here, but I think that we are okay. Welcome back to the Zoom Chevra. It was great, Schos Baruch Hashem, to see all of you back with us in Shir. My apologies for the last couple of days. Thank you, very special thank you to Jeremy Lassen and to Moshe Abramson for working so hard to make sure that the daf somehow arrived online, even when we did not have internet here at the shul. Tremendous yeshkach to them. We'll also begin by thanking our sponsors for this morning's shir. To thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Sivan, Paul and Kathy Pollack, for dedicating all the Shirman Joshos this month, and Schos V'Rafuah Shalema for Kathy's sister, Donna Baker Matson. We thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Brian and Melanie Levine, for dedicating all the Shirman Joshos this month, with tremendous Hakar Satov to the entire Shir. May be Zochem Eretz Hashem to learn Torah together for many years to come. And we have a Daf Yomi sponsorship today, an anonymous sponsorship in memory of Harav Yerachmiel Gershon ben Tzvi Yehuda Edelstein. So Rav Gershon Edelstein, Zecher Tzadik V'Kadosh Levracha, not just Rosh Shiva of Panovich, but one of the incredible Gedolei Hadar. You know, sometimes people go ahead and rise to prominence because of things that they do, you know, political parties that they're affiliated with, and then you have, or other different accomplishments, career accomplishments, and then you have some people who literally their entire prominence, their entire greatness is rooted in the Torah that they learn. So you have people, they're more malachim than men. You have people like Rav Chaim Kanievsky, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, Rav Gershon Edelstein, Zecher Tzadik Levracha, men whose greatness absolutely, fundamentally, and totally stemmed from the fact that they lived lives totally immersed in Torah. Totally immersed in Torah. And again, with such a diligence and such a commitment. And it was that Torah study that literally made them great. We sometimes speak about the impact that Talmud Torah has on a person. And you see these Gedolim who are personifications of just what Torah does to you when you are steeped in it from morning until night. Incredible loss for Klal Yisrael. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, Tzaddik's Neshama should have an Aliyah, and Halavai Meretz Hashem should be a Melis Yosha for Klal Yisrael. It's also important for us to recognize they also dedicate our learning in memory of Meir Tamari. Meir Tamari was the young man, 32 years old, father of two, who was murdered in a drive-by shooting right outside of the community of Shaked in the Shomron. And again, an overwhelming one watched the scenes from the Levaya. He left behind two young children, and an overwhelming, unfortunately, in this latest wave of violence, we become, unfortunately, a little bit desensitized. We read it as a news item, and then we simply go on with our day. But sometimes take a step back and to recognize that for a family within Klal Yisrael, their life has been irreversibly changed. You know, Am Yisrael is strong, Jews are strong, and we're able to recover, and we're able to go ahead and regain our life momentum, even in the aftermath of tragedy, but it places one on a totally different life trajectory. Two little boys who are going to grow up without their father, right? A young woman who now has to face the uncertainty of life alone. It's overwhelming, absolutely overwhelming. And we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, that Meir's Neshama Shem Hashem Shavin Aliyah, Chosh Baruch Hu should give him menucha tachas kanfei Ashchina and a look out for his wife and children in the years ahead. Well, so with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Tes Zayin 16. We are picking up in Miras Hashem on Tes Vav Amud Beis 15b, and we are picking up. We have a lot to do today, but some really very interesting Gemara. So we're picking up Amar of Chisda Gidut Chamish Umechitza Chamisha. It is 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 13 lines up from the bottom. So I'll say, the Gemara says as follows. Remember again, we were talking about the concept of combining halachic principles. So specifically, again, where did this come up? So this came up where if you want to certify a get, partially through b'fanei nechtav b'fanei nechtam, and partially through kiyum shtaros. So it doesn't work. Choose a team, right? Choose a mahalach, choose an approach, choose a direction. You can't do a combination of both. So now I'll say, so now once the Gemara brought this up, the Gemara says, that's interesting. So is that true that you can't combine different halachic processes in the effort to go ahead and create one unified result? So the Gemara wants to give some examples of things that look like we can. So watch this. So Amar Rav Chisda, Gidut chamisho mechitza, chamisha ein mitzdarfin, achi okulu mechitza okulu begidud. So this is fascinating. Remember again, back to our Masechet Shabbos days, our Erevin days. So remember again, the definition of a Reshus Hayochid is an area that is enclosed by a barrier of 10 tfachim. 10 tfachim or higher. So we'll say, so imagine the following situation. Imagine for a moment that you have, let's say, a large hole, but it's not really a hole. We'll call it a large area that's been dug out. And let's say again in that area you have sidewalls of dirt that are 5 tfachim, and now you want to build on top of that a mechitza that's 5 tfachim. So effectively, you have 10 tfachim of wall, so to speak, of mechitza, but remember, 5 of it is natural earth, and 5 of it is actually, humanly constructed barrier. So the Gemara says, so Rav Chisda says, it doesn't work. O kula mechitza, o kula begidud. Again, can you have a mechitza that's like an embankment? Can you have a mechitza that's made out of earth? Sure, but you got to choose a team. Either your wall, right, has to be mechitza. Mechitza means man-made, or ultimately, again, your mechitza could be earth. But you can't have a combination of both. The Arshrei said, not true. Gidut chamisho mechitza hey mitzdarfin. So Mereimar argues on Rav Chisda. Mereimar says, nah, you absolutely can. You could have 5 tfachim of earth and 5 tfachim of wall, and it's not a problem. And Rabbi said, halacha is v'hilchasa mitzdarfin. The halacha is that in fact it is mitzdaref. They do combine, and you can have a combination of the two. Good. Another, and by the way, that is halacha l'maisa. We know that for Hilchos Shabbos, in order to create an enclosed area for Reshus Hayochid, you could rely on 2 different types of mechitzos combining together to form the requisite 10 tefach shir. Incredible. Next, Bayilfa. So we'll say this is absolutely great because this is what we're learning in Smichas Chaver. Get ready for this. So Bayilfa, Yadayim Tohoros Lechatzaim, O Im Tohoros Lechatzaim. So we'll say there is a concept ultimately again of Tumas Yadayim. What's Tumas Yadayim? We'll say again, a little Smichas Chaver Chazara. What's Tumas Yadayim? Chazal, where goes there? Chazal made a decree that hands are shnios. That a hand is, an unwashed hand is considered to be a sheni l'tuma. What's the reason for that? Chazal wanted to go ahead and protect truma. That was it. We wanted to make sure that Kohanim would go ahead and wash their hands before consuming truma, and therefore, and remember again, I will say, I really feel that we actually had like a shtickle mastery of Tum and Tara in our Sota days, right? So remember again, if you're a sheni, what does a sheni create? What does a sheni create? A shlishi. But a shlishi can only be created by truma, right? And again, where can you create a revi'i? Kachim. Good. Excellent. See, excellent. Wonderful. Right? Chulin ultimately again bottoms out at a sheni, but ultimately truma goes. So therefore, again, this was a takana ultimately made for truma. So I will say, so now watch this. So in order to go ahead and alleviate the sheni tuma status of hands, we do netilas yadayim. This is we wash. So the Gemara says as follows. So by ilfa, yadayim toros lechatzon, in toros lechatzon. Can you purify hands partially or not? Or not. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? So are you saying maybe, what it will say, remember again, this is just Monday night share. So in order to go ahead and wash, you need a kli, and that kli, that utensil must hold at least the revius, right? The revius is the minimum amount of water to be used for netilas yadayim. So when we ask, can you do partial netilas yadayim, are we asking maybe could 2 people wash simultaneously from the same kli? Meaning, let's say you have Reuven and Shimon, they put their hands next to each other, and literally again, they pour the water over both of their hands. So maybe, essentially, each is getting, quote unquote, half revius. Is that the shaila? That can't be the shaila. Gemara, so listen to this. V'hatanan me revius notun l'adayim le'achad v'afilu l'shnayim. Actually, we'll say, interestingly enough, halacha l'maisa, you could use the same revius even for 2 people. Right? Isn't that fascinating? You use the same revius even for 2 people. If you look at Rashi says over here, Rashi says, Mashu Beit Shemi Revius. It's 4 lines up from the bottom of Rashi. So maybe we're asking, can two people wash from the same Revius? We'll say, just to understand, the cases where their hands would be next to each other, right? They're pouring the water over the right hand, pouring the water over the left hand. So essentially, each one is getting half a revius. Is that our question? So Rashi says, no, afil l'shnayim, kevan de meikara havashiura, v'ka'asim shiari tara, hacham mefarish v'chabasa. So it's actually quite fascinating. Two people can actually utilize the same revius. Two people can actually utilize the same revius. I will say, because since it's coming from the same kli, and a revius ultimately again is the shir for natila, if there's a simultaneity with the two parties, i.e. they're washing their hands together, halacha l'maaseh works. So that can't be the case of chatzon. So what is the case? So the Gemara says, Vela de kamashi chada yadeh. So maybe it's talking about where halacha l'maaseh, you go ahead and you wash one hand, and then you go ahead and you wash the other. In other words, what does that mean? So we learned, Hanolto yadav achas binatila, va'achas b'shtifa yadav tahoros. So I will say, listen to this. The Gemara assumes maybe some of the following case. We learned this all on Monday night. It's incredible. But let's say, halacha l'maisa, there are two ways. Well, there's more than two ways, but for our purposes right now, there's two ways you could affect natilas daim. How? Ultimately through pouring or immersing. So let's say, maybe the shaila is like this. What happens if you pour over one hand and immerse the other, right? So let's say what we're looking for. Just why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? Like I was thinking the same exact thing, right? Why are we doing this? Let's say, because remember again, we had in yesterday's daf the concept that you can't combine two processes to produce a result. So you can't go ahead and combine the b'fanei nechtam and b'fanei nechtam together with kiyum shtaris to produce a certified get. So we're just now taking that and we're saying, wow, that's really interesting. What about other cases of halacha? So for example, for natilas yadayim, can I wash one hand and immerse the other hand, thereby employing two mechanisms of natilas yadayim to accomplish the same result? So the Gemara says, v'hatnan, we learned, achas b'natila v'achas b'shtifa yadav tahoros. That actually works. So we'll say, so what is the case? What is the case ultimately again of yadav tahoros lechatzon? Right? This was Amemar. If this was Ilfa's question, can you affect partial purification of hands? So what's the case? So we'll say, so it can't be the case of two people washing at once, because that's okay. Can't be the case of doing one hand with natila and one hand with tevila, because that's okay. Ve'ela, listen to this. This is fascinating. Ve'ela, dikamashi palga didei. So I'll say, what's the case? The case is where you wash one half of your hand at a time. Now let's say, what does this mean? Take a look at Rashi. It's fascinating. So I'll say, second line up from the bottom, palga didei, ad haperek, Ad aprak having mitzvahs natila, v'natal chatzi shir tchila, v'nagva, v'chazah v'natal chatzi acher. So I will say this is very interesting. Right? You're supposed to wash up until your wrist. You're supposed to wash until your wrist. So I will say, so imagine the following situation. You wash from your fingertips to your knuckles. You wash that area, then you dry it. Then you go back and wash from your knuckles to your wrist. Don't ask why, right? Don't ask why. You had a couple of minutes during the day, right? You decided to experiment halachically, right? So much better to experiment halachically than with other things, right? So nice, right? So I do this two-stage. So I'll say, so what's the shaila? Does this work? In other words, I will say, now this is a little bit different because remember again, up until now we've been speaking about really employing two different halachic processes to create a unified result. Here, what we're saying over here is what? Kind of one process, but doing it in two stages. So it's not really the same as what we're talking about by Gittin, but nevertheless interesting. So therefore, the Gemara is suggesting this is what Ilfa means when he asks, Yadav tahoros lechatzon. Can you affect partial purity? In other words, one part of hand washing at a time, and then it will say, at the end of the day, have I washed my entire hand and washed my hand? Yes. It's just I did it in two parts, so does that work? Do those two parts, can they be mitzdarif with each other? So the Gemara says, let's understand. So the Gemara says, well, this seems to be kind of open and shut. Rabbi Yanai says, you can't do that. You can't do partial washings and then have them go ahead and combine for one comprehensive wash. This seems to be open and shut. Tushnar says, no, lo tzricha dika mashke tofeach. Oh, what's the case, Rabbi? Say, watch this. I wash from fingertips to knuckles, I dry, but I don't fully dry. In other words, my hands are still wet. There's still some residual from that act of washing, and then I go ahead and I wash from the knuckles to the wrist. In other words, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is when Rabbi Yanai says you cannot wash part of the hand and do the other part of the hand, what is that talking about? You can't wash, like a real Baltimorean, wash, right? You can't never, right? You can't go ahead and say, you can't wash from your fingertips to your knuckles and fully dry it, and then do from the knuckles to the wrist. Everybody, but what happens if you wash from the fingertips to the knuckles, dry, but there's still moisture? Then go ahead and wash from the knuckles to the wrist. Maybe in that case they can combine, because they're both like, essentially, since there's a residual from the first act of washing, maybe they're still considered to be combined. So the Gemara says, Mashke tofeach mahavi. Somewhere says, who cares? Right? Who cares? Just because there's some moisture left, why should that allow the second washing to combine with the first? After all, v'hatzanan we learned, was a top of tezayim. So this is actually very interesting. So we'll say hanitzok. Nitzok means a flow of liquid. V'kitafros. Kitafros, Rashi says over here is har meshupa shemedrono mechudat harbe. Or we'll say a current of water, right? Or a flow of water running down a slope. So imagine again, you have a sloped hillside or a sloped mountainside, you have water running down it. So we'll say, listen to this. Umashke tofeach, or moisture, eno chiber, lo l'tumah v'lo l'tar. So we'll say, so the truth is, we've actually seen this case before. Just to give you the example of this, if you go ahead, right, and you pour the contents of a tahar kli into a tamei kli, ultimately, again, we saw this before, the pour, right, the nitzuk does not connect the two kelim. So therefore, again, by definition, even though, again, the tahar kli is connected to a tamei kli through the pour, ultimately, again, that pour does not make the tahar kli tamei. That's nitzuk. And the same idea applies to ketafros, which is a current running down a slope, and mashke tofeach. So this mashke tofeach, this is what we're talking about. Mashke tofeach, if you have liquid, you dry it, and now there's some left, and then you have more liquid, that residual moisture does not connect ultimately again to the current moisture. Take a look at Rashi, eno chibor, l'tuma, kigon hama'arev meklitar l'klitame. For example, one pours from a tahar utensil to a tamei utensil. V'nitzuk kiluach mechaber mashke shnei hakelim eno chibor l'tamei mashken hal yonim. So it's exactly what we just said. You pour from a tahar kli into a tamei kli. The fact that the two kelim are connected by the stream of liquid does not make the tahar kli tamei. V'chene ketafros im ha'aviru derech daf hanasuchim madra tachtonim mechubarim l'tumah. We don't have to go through the rest of this. But look at Rashi. Tofeach latfiach, the next one. Rashi says sheyesh mashke harbe. For example, let's say you have a lot of liquid. Shim tafach bo. I'm getting ahead of myself. So we'll say. So the point over here is, right, without even descending into all of these halachas, what did the Bryce explicitly say? The Mishnah explicitly said that tofeach, mashke tofeach, moisture does not create a connection. Residual moisture does not create a connection. So let's plug this back. So therefore, again, we seem to have answered our same question, which is, remember, where are you supposed to, let's go through Hilchos and Design. Where are you supposed to wash until? From your fingertips to your wrist. So in the case in question, Rabbi say, what am I doing? I'm washing from my fingertips to my knuckles. I'm drying, but my hands are still moist. There's still moisture there. Then I go back and wash from my knuckles to my wrist. So what's my shaila? My shaila is that considered to be one act of comprehensive hand washing? How could it be one act of comprehensive hand washing? You did it in two stages. The Gemara posits that since there's residual moisture left on the first washing between my fingertips and the knuckles, that should be able to combine with the second washing from my knuckles to my wrist. To which the Gemara says, no. It's a Mefurish Mishnah. The Mishnah says that mashke tofeach eno chibor. Just like a pour is not ultimately again a connection, so to residual moisture is not a connection either, and therefore that's not kol natilas yadayim. To which the Gemara says, no. Lo tzricha, we'll say second line down from the top, tezayin amud aleph, lo tzricha, Di'ika tofeach lahatfiach. Ultimately, again, about say what's the case. It's actually fascinating. What's the case? The case is where halacha l'maisa, there's so much moisture that it has the ability to convey wetness to something else. Or as Rabbi say, in halacha, there are different gradations of moisture. There's what's called tofeach. Tofeach means there's moisture, right? But not enough moisture to make something else wet. Then there's tofeach lahatfiach, which means there's so much moisture that it has the ability to convey moisture to something else. That if it were to touch something else, it would make that wet as well. So Rabbi said what the Gemara is suggesting is as follows: that halacha l'maisa, maybe, okay, in the case of where I wash, so fascinating, in the case of where I wash, and ultimately, again, I dry the first part, and then, so there's a little bit of moisture, but if you were to touch that moisture to something else, it would not make that second item wet. Everyone agrees in that case, then when you go ahead and you wash the second part, from your knuckles to your wrist, it doesn't combine. But maybe, when after washing the first part, from your fingertips to your knuckles, there's so much moisture, that if you were to touch it to something else, that second item would become wet. Maybe that's enough residual moisture to combine with the second washing as well. To which the Gemara says, but we learned that as well. Hanami tanina. So let's listen to this. Hanami tanina, tofeach latfiach chibor. So we learned that already. That halacha l'maisa, if something is like dripping wet, very moist, that it can convey moisture to something else, it can serve as a connection. To which the Gemara says, well, maybe, we already learned this. The Gemara says, Dilma le'in mikvaos Rabbi Hudahi. Well, maybe this is just a din in the mikvah, and ultimately reflective of the view of Rabbi Huda. In other words, Rabbi say, maybe the concept, so Rabbi say, so just to understand where we're heading right now, let's just keep track of this, right? So halacha l'maisa, let's go with what, right? How should you wash your hands, Rabbi say? How should you wash your hands? In general, be normal. Right? Be normal. It's good advice in life. In other words, there's some people that are always looking for like the cones. Like, always like, just be normal, right? Just do what you're supposed to do and get on with your life. So in other words, wash your hands. Okay, so whatever the reason, again, somebody's doing it in two parts. So let's go with what everybody agrees with. If you wash fingertips to knuckles and dry, fully dry, and then go from knuckles to wrist, everyone agrees? No good. Let's say you wash fingertips to knuckle, dry, but leave a little bit of residual moisture, but not enough moisture to convey moisture to something else, and then wash the second part. Everyone agrees? Doesn't work. We'll say you wash fingertips to knuckles, dry, but your hands are still wet. As evidenced by the fact that if they were to touch something else, they would make that second item wet, and then you wash from the knuckles to the wrist. What's the halacha? It works. Based on the Gemara, it works. Because tofeach latfiach, moisture, right? Moisture that is moist enough to convey moisture to something else is called the connection. It's called the chibor. So Gemara says, okay, but we learned that already. That's not a chiddush. Tush Gemara says, one second. Maybe we learned it, but we learned it in an interesting context of mikvos. Supposed to listen to this. This is such a great case. So let's say Tes Zayin Amud Aleph, 5 lines down. Disnan. Mikvah sheshba arba'im sa'ah. So listen to this. You say you have a mikvah that has exactly 40 sa'ah. Right? So what happens? Mechuvanos. The yardu shnai v'tavlu. Watch this. So I'll say now, what happens? 2 guys go into the mikvah at the same time. Right? Ruvain and Shimon. If you've ever been in that matzav, it's uncomfortable, right? But Lamaisa, right? Two guys go into the mikvah at the same time, Ruvain and Shimon. Now both say, now watch this. So we'll say, what are we concerned about? When one of them leaves the mikvah, no, not a chatzitza issue, because remember, there's a little bit of room in the mikvah. Let's calm down over here, right? It's not that kind of mikvah, right? So the mice again. So let's say, what are we concerned about? Right, we're concerned about the fact that when you go out of the mikvah, you're not just taking the kedusha with you, you're also taking some water with you. So lemaisa, if the mikvah was exactly 40 sa'ah, that means when the first guy leaves, so lemaisa, the second guy is really in a deficient mikvah. So watch this. So shnei mevas achas tarim. So if they both immerse at the same time, then they're both tar. B'zeh achar zeh. We'll say what happens if Reuven goes in. Reuven comes out, then Shimon goes in, then ultimately Rishon tar v'asheni tameh, which makes sense, right? Because once Shimon gets in there, then what? Shimon is going into a mikvah deficient 40 saw. Not a full 40 saw. And I was saying, watch this. This is fascinating. Rabbi Huda says, "Im hayu raglav shel rishon nogos b'mayim af hashenitar." So I will say, so there is a way, even if they're going consecutively, ultimately again for it to work, even for Shimon guy number 2. How? Essentially, when Shimon goes in, we tell Ruvain, "Do me a favor, stand in the mikvah." Stand in the mikvah. I will say, so as long as Ruvain, the first guy to go in, is standing in the mikvah, ultimately again any water that is on his person is considered to be part of the mikvah as well. Fascinating. So I will say, so take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, so no goes by says, as long as Ruvain is standing in the mikvah at the time that Shimon is immersing, Rashi says, Av Shenitar, the keman de mechabri mayim sha'al harishon l'mei mikvah damu. Because we'll say it's as if that halacha l'maisa, any water, since Reuven is standing in the mikvah, any water on him is considered to be part of the mikvah. Therefore, when Shimon goes in, Shimon halacha l'maisa is immersing in a complete mikvah. So we'll say, so again, what does that have to do with what we're saying? Because here's a case of tofeach l'hatfiach, right? Reuven is dripping wet. So what do you see from here? That when it's dripping wet, it is considered to be a chibur. It is considered to be a connection. So therefore, I will say again, so back to the Netilas Yadayim case, the halacha would be the same as well, which is that if you wash from fingertips to knuckles, dried, but ultimately, again, the moisture on your hand is still moist enough to convey moisture to something else, then washed again from knuckles to wrist, it actually would work. Halacha l'maisa, it actually would work, because in the case of tofeach latfiach, enough moisture to convey moisture to something else, ultimately, again, is considered to be a chibur. Good. So we'll say, so now listen to this. I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah. Listen to the very fascinating case. So we'll say, so again, we're still on our kick over here about trying to figure out the different halachic processes go ahead and combine to create a uniform result. So listen to this case. I'm Rabbi Yirmiyah. Hari Amru. Chazal said, Haba rosho v'ruba b'mayim shuvin, v'tar shnaflu al rosho v'al rubo shlosha lugin mayim shuvin tameh. They will say this is a fascinating halacha. If a person goes ahead and literally puts his head and his body, right, the head and his majority of his body, underneath mayim shuvin is drawn water. Drawn water, right? So you go ahead and will say you have water in a kli, you pour it over yourself. If ultimately, again, that water covers your head and the majority of your body, you are tameh, right? Tameh, exactly, right? Or if you have a Torah person upon whom 3 lugin of mayim shuvim fell upon your tameh. Now, what's going on over here? So we'll say this is fascinating. Look at Rashi. Rashi is the first wide line. This is fascinating. Tameh litruma. Ad sheyitbol. I will say this is a rabbinic decree. I will say, do you hear what this? This is incredible. So in other words, you go ahead and you pour drawn water over yourself, right? Take a bucket of drawn water or a large barrel of drawn water, you pour it over yourself. You are tameh for truma purposes. Now, what is this halacha? And I will say, listen to this. Umigzeras shmonas hadavar he parakam in the Masech Shabbos. Befarish my timer gazrala. Let's listen to this. Why did Chazal institute this? Fascinating. Lefi shahaya lahem ma'aros suruchim letvila ula'achar tvila hayu rochtzin b'mayim she'uvin v'eschilu lomar lo elu matarin ela elu matarin v'gazra alein v'shuv gazra atar shnaf alav shlosha lugi mayim she'uvin de'i lo ha'kamah. Let's listen to this. People, remember, for a mikvah, what do you use for a mikvah? Right? Gathered rainwater. So I will say there used to be mikvos that were accumulated rainwater that accumulated in caves that people used for tefillah. What was the problem? It was gross. Right? The mikvah just, again, it was kosher, but it was very unpleasant. So what would people do? After the mikvah, what would they do? Take a shower. Over time, what ended up happening was people thought, what affected the tara? The shower. So we'll say, so Chazal felt there was an incredible danger, right, to the core halachos of Tuma and Tara, and therefore halacha l'maisa Chazal were gozer, that if you take a shower after the mikvah, right, mayim she'uvin, you go ahead and you wash after the mikvah, ultimately, again, you are tameh for truma purposes, right? Fascinating. All of this was to safeguard the actual halachos of tevilah, of immersion. Okay, so now watch this. So here's the shaila. By Rabbi Yirmiyah, chetziav bebiyah, the chetziav binafila mai. So Rabbi says, and remember again, there are two ways in which you could become tamei post immersion, right? Number one is ultimately maim shuvin, drawn water poured over your body. Ultimately, again, right? Or I should say, habarosh of ruba maim shuvin. You enter. Well, it's going to be like a shower, right? So again, putting your head and the majority of your body underneath drawn water, right? Or 3 lugin of water that go ahead and fall on you. So here's the shaila. I will say, what happens if I showered half of my body and then water fell from a different source on another part of my body? So does that, so now I will say, effectively, my entire body, right, has come under drawn water. Part of it benefila, and part of it ultimately, again, through entering. What's the halacha? Teiku. So we'll say, what is this shaila? Again, once again, it's the same shaila. It's different processes combining to form a comprehensive result. Does that work over here? Teiku. Good. Next case, Amra Papa, Hari Amru Bal Kari Cholish Nasalav Tishakab Mayim Tar. So we'll say, listen to this. We know that there's halacha Bal Kari. So Bal Kari, remember again, was a Takanas Ezra. Ezra Ukirashi, Bal Kari Choletar, the Divrei Torah, the Ezra Tikin Tvilin Bal Karion, Kodum Shis Aska Torah. So let's remember again, Ezra came along and instituted that if a man has a seminal emission, he has to go to the mikvah before studying Torah. This was a takana of Ezra. Takana of Ezra. So so what happens? The Chazal, however, were makil on a chola, right? On a person who still can't get to the mikvah. All you need to do is pour 9 kabin of water over this person. 9 kabin, which I will say, by the way, the Mishnah Berurah brings this down. He says, for Takanas Ezra, let's say a person has a similar mission and he can't get to a mikvah. So again, whether or not, we know in general we're not makbid on Takanas Ezra today. By the Hasidim they are, but in general we're not makbid on Takanas Ezra. But again, the Mishnah Berurah says, there is an easy way you could take care of this, which is take a shower. Take a shower. So ultimately, again, because that's called Mayim Shuvin. The 9 kabin of Mayim Shuvin also, Bidi Evet takes care of Tumas Keri, for I should say, our Takanas Ezra. So ultimately, again, I will say, let's say a fine situation. Ideally, after a similar mission, according to Ezra, you go to the mikvah. Person is ill, he can't make it to the mikvah. So what can you do? You can pour 9 kabin of water over him. So by Rapapa, Chetzi Betil, Chetzi Benesina Mai. Let's listen to this case. What happens for the chola? What do you do, Abba say? He immerses part of his body, but they pour 9 kavin over the rest of his body. Does that work? Does that work to affect Tara? Teiku. The Gemara kind of leaves it open-ended. So we'll say really a very interesting idea. A very interesting idea, especially by the tefillah cases. Can you go ahead and utilize 2 different mechanisms in order to go ahead and affect Tara? Can you do a partial tefillah and a partial pouring, right? Does that work to affect Natila? And we'll say the Gemara ultimately ends that off as a teiku. Pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. I'll say, by the way, I thought that in that statement, you see like just a couple lines before it said, Bari Rabbi Yirmiyah, Chetziav Bebiyah, the Chetziav Benefila Mai. So I will say, those words, I was very drawn to those words, if you think about it. I'll say, what does it mean? Chetziav Bebiyah means, half of me is moving, right? Bia means like coming, right? Chatzia bebia, right? There's half of me that is moving, that is progressing, that is accomplishing. The chatzia benefila, and there's half of me that's failing. So I'll say, so what's my status? What's my status? Chatzia bebia v'chatzia benefila. So where am I holding on? So we'll say, what does the Gemara say? What does the Gemara say? Teiku. It's hard. You see, I'm both saying, in life, you never want to be 50-50. You never want to be 50-50. You never want to be Chetziav Bebiyah, the Chetziav Benefila. Because if you're 50-50, what are you? What are you? And the Gemara says, we don't know, Teiku. We're not sure what you are. Therefore, Rabbi say again, really all our goal in life is to be absolutely righteous. That some of us may get to, but most of us are not going to get to. But that's okay. That doesn't have to be the goal. The goal, Rabbi say, is just don't let it be 50-50. At least let it be 51% bebiyah and 49% benefila. Because as long as I have the majority on my side, then it's clear that ultimately I'm the kind of person who's moving forward in life. But if it's mamish, chetzia bebiyah, chetzia benefila, I'm half successful, half moving myself, but half failing. What is my status? The Gemara says, really not sure. I will say all we need to do is in life push ourselves over the 50% mark. Just make sure I'm living the kind of life that has a majority of goodness, a majority of purity, and then ultimately, again, the kivun, the direction of my life is clearly towards the good. Incredible. So the goes back to so remember again, the Mishnah said, if one guy says b'fanei nechtav, one guy says b'fanei nechtam, ultimately again, Pasal, Amar Rav Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Amar Rabbi Yochanan. Lo shanu ela shena get yotzi mitachas deishneim. Oh, so we'll say, when doesn't this work? This doesn't work when both of them are not the shluchim to bring the get. Aval get yotzi mitachas deishneim. But I will say, if both of them ultimately, again, are the shluchim to bring the get, i.e., if the husband appointed both of them as the shluchim to bring the get, then ultimately, again, kosher. It will say, it's kosher even if what? It's kosher even if one of them says befanei nechtav and one of them says befanei nechtam. Now, why is that? Alma kasavar shnayim sheviu get medinas hayam ain't tzrichin sheyomru befanenu nechtav or befanenu nechtam. Why did I say listen to this? Why? Because apparently, again, the Tana of our Mishnah holds that in general, the concept of befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam is only when? When you have one witness or one shaliach bringing the get. But if the get is being brought by two, remember again, I will say by definition, two is a testimonial unit. Once you have a intact testimonial unit, then what? You don't need b'fanei nechtav or b'fanei nechtam anymore. So I will say, just to point out something very interesting, when do we say in the Mishnah that if one guy says b'fanei nechtav and one guy says b'fanei nechtam, that it doesn't work? That's only when only one of them is the shaliach to bring the get. But if both of them were appointed by the husband to be the shluchim to bring the get, then halacha l'maisa, even if one says b'fanei nechtam, it works, because the truth is, even if neither of them said anything, ultimately again it works. To which the Gemara says, Abai says, Elamiata. 1 second. Look at the seif of the Mishnah. Elamiata seifa diktani shnaim or b'fanenu nechtav. I will say, what was the latter case of the Mishnah? Two guys say. Ultimately, again, it was written in our presence. One says, it was signed in my presence, right? So you only have one, right? So ultimately, Pasal. Ultimately, such a get is Pasal. Rabbi Yehuda says it's kosher. So let's analyze. Taima de'in haget yotzi mitachas deishneim. Now we'll say now, bepashtos, the reason ultimately, again, that it's not good is because you have only one witness bringing the get, not two. So the Gemara says, "Haget yosei mitachas deishneim machshir rabbanan." Ultimately, but it sounds like over here that if two witnesses were to bring the get, then halacha l'maisa, it would work. It would work, because we'll say any time you have two witnesses, I say witnesses it's really two shluchim, right? Anytime you have two shluchim bringing the get, I will say, remember again that obviates the entire need in general for b'fanei nechtam. Amar le'in, he said, yeah, that would be true. That'd be true. So we'll say, when you only have one witness bringing the get, so what is the machlokes over here? What is machlokes with the Rabbanon? So let's listen to this. So Mar Savar Gazrin Dama Asilach Luvikim Shtaras Talma. So one opinion says we are concerned that you may come to go ahead and confuse this case with a regular case of Kiyim Shtaras. Umar Savar Lo Gazrinan. And the other opinion says, no, we're not worried ultimately again that you may come to confuse this with a regular case of Kiyim Shtaras. Since I remember again, this is a case that's happening through one witness. Lishnachrin, it was another version of the previous discussion. Lishnachrin Amrida, Amr of Shmuel Bar Yehuda, Amr of Yochanan, Afilu get yotzi mitach hasidei shneim pasal. Even I will say, if the get is produced by two witnesses, by two shluchim, it's still going to be pasal. Alma Kasava, what do you see from here? Shnaim Sheviu get Medinas Hayam, Srichin Sheyomru, Befanenu Nechtam. So we'll say in this alternate version, we're reaching the opposite conclusion that even if two witnesses bring the get, they still have to say Befanenu Nechtam or Befanenu Nechtam. I'm really Abai says 1 second. So we'll say this is just the opposite version of the previous discussion. I'm really Abai says 1 second. 1 second. Elamiata. What about the later case of the Mishnah, where ultimately again you have two witnesses saying the get was signed in our presence, or I'm sorry, written in our presence, and one witness says the get was signed in my presence. Basel. The Rabbanon say it's basel. But Rabbi Yehuda says ultimately again it's kosher. Afilu get yotze mitachas deishneim pasli Rabbanon. Would that be true that even if two people produce the get, two shluchim, that ultimately the Rabbanon would still passel it, Amar le in. So ultimately, again, he responded, yes. If that's the case, b'may kamiflagi, so we'll say, what are they arguing about? So ultimately, again, what is the source of the machlokes? So b'may kamiflagi, mar savar lefi shein bekiyin l'shma, umar savar lefi shein edim mitsuyin l'kaimo. So we'll say, literally, back to where we started. Rabban, incredible. Back to where we started. So we'll say, so what's the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon? The machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon seems to be about the reason for befanei nechtav ubefanei nechtam. That again, I will say, so take a look at Rashi. Rashi is, you see Tosas Alma? Tosas Alma. So if you look at Tosas Alma, just move your finger all the way to the left. It's right there. So let's listen to this. So Tanakama Savar, the Tanakama holds, Lefi she'ein bikiyin l'shma hilchach, Shnaim sheviu get suichin lomar v'hani lo klum amru kidamina. So we'll say, the Tanakama, i.e. the Rabbanon, hold that the entire reason for befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam is because in Medinas Hayam, they were not bikiyin l'shma. They were not bikiyin l'shma. They will say, because of that, even if you have two witnesses bringing the get, they still have to say befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam. Right? You still need it. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda holds lefi she'ein edin mitsuyin l'kaimo, and therefore, again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, once you have two shluchim bringing the get, then what? Your kiyum shtaris is right there. There is no need for befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam. So what we'll say. So therefore, again, in this second version of the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanan and the Mishnah, it is back to our original machlokes Rabba and Rava, namely again edin mitsuyin l'kaimo, edin mitsuyin l'kaimo in bikiyim l'shma. To which the Gemara says, 1 second, that's interesting. So lema the Rabba the Rava Tanohi. So Rabba says, interesting. So apparently, what began as a machlokes Rabba and Rava, right, the machlokes Amoraim, now turns out to be a machlokes Tanoim. Very interesting. To which the Gemara says, no. Lo. The Gemara says, lo. Rava mataris kilish nakama. The Rava will say no. Rava prefers Rabbi to ultimately go ahead and accept the first version of the machlokes, where the machlokes between Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon was really focused on whether or not we will come to confuse Gittin with kiyum shtaras or not. So that's Rava. So therefore, Rava sidesteps this. The Rabba Amalacha, Rabba will say no. The Kuli Alma Ba'ina L'Shma. Ultimately, everyone agrees that obviously the reason you need befanei nechtav or befanei nechtam is to certify the lishmakheit of the get. So what's the case over here? How come I ask? Shabbos over here in the Mishnah, what's the machlokes Rabbi and the Rabbanon? Watch this. La'achar shalamdu. We're dealing, Rabbi say, and again over here in a situation where they already learned the halachos of lishma in chutz la'aretz. Remember we saw this before. V'gzera shemiyachzer hadavar lekilkulo kamiflagi. And we'll say, so what are we concerned about? Do we have to legislate lest the matter return to what it once was? Remember we saw this before? We'll say a number of interesting facts in the machlokes Rabba and Rava. Even Rabba, who holds that originally the need for befanei nechtav befanei nechtam ultimately was because lefi she'ein bekiyin l'shma. They were not proficient in laws of l'shma overseas, outside of Eretz Yisrael. Even Rabba agrees that what happened, there was a turnaround. Chutz La'aretz Jewry got its act together, right? And suddenly they became proficient in the Shema. I'll say, what's the concern now? The concern is, do we have to be afraid that things will regress? So Rabba suggests that's the machlokes Rabbi Yehuda and the Rabbanon. The Mar Savar Gazvinan, Umar Savar Lo Gazvinan. One opinion holds, i.e. the Rabbanon, that Allah Chalamais, we have to be concerned that things are going to regress, and therefore what? Even when two witnesses are bringing the get, ultimately, again, they still have to say befanei nechtav u'befanei nechtam, even though, again, right now we know that Gittin written in Medinas Hayam are absolutely written l'shma. We have to be concerned that, again, things may regress, and therefore, again, even if two witnesses are bringing it, they still need befanei nechtam. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda holds Mar Savar Lo Gazvinan. On the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda holds no, that is not the case. That Allah Chalamais, again, now that we're dealing with the situation of Achar Shalamdu, ultimately, again, after they learn the halachos of the Shema, we're therefore, again, there's no real need for befanei nechtam anymore, and we are not concerned that what? That Allah Chalamais, things are going to regress, and therefore, when two bring the get, when there are two shluchim, there is no need for befanei nechtav u befanei nechtam. Okay, so I'll say, so interestingly enough, good. Good, fine. So I'll say good. Rashi just speaks all this out, but we pretty much did already. Good, let's go weiter. So we'll say, why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda argue in the first case as well? Or we'll say, look at Rashi just a moment. This is Rashi in the wide lines on the bottom, 3 lines in. So we'll say, remember again, in the Reisha case, where you have one guy saying Mefani Nechtav, one guy saying Mefani Nechtam, Kevan de Yotzi Mitachas de Shneim, de Lakaimu Leka Lemechash, Ulishma Nami Halam du Lekilguna. So we'll say, I just also want to point out, remember, one of the things we established in the last parak is that Rabbah agrees with Rava. Right? Remember again, we saw that. Rabbah agrees with Rava, and that there is still an issue of Ein Eidim Mitzuyim L'Kaimo. Now remember again, I will say the beauty in this case, in the Sefer case, is there are 2 witnesses coming along, right? So therefore, again, according to Rabbi Yehuda, there's no problem of Lishma, because it's Achar Shalamdu, and we're not Choshesh Shema Yachzer Dever L'Kol Kulo. We're not concerned that it's going to regress. And number 2, because there are 2 witnesses over there, therefore what? You have your Kiyim Shtaris. So let's say the Gemara says, why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda argue in the first case? Right? What was the first case? One guy says B'fanei Nechtav, one guy says B'fanei Nechtam. So I will say, so B'pashtos, if we're talking about a situation over here, where halacha l'maisa, both are witnesses to bring the get, so according to Rabbi Yehuda, the get should be kosher. Why should the get be kosher? There's no concern of lishma, right? Why? Why is no concern of lishma? Why? Achar shalamdu, they already learned, and we're not choshesh that it's going to go back to what it was, and there's no concern for kiyum shtaras. Why? 2 witnesses are bringing the get. So yet the Mishnah said that case is puzzle. Why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda argue over there? So the Gemara says, "V'lift nog down Rabbi Yehuda b'reisha ha'itmar Allah avar ula chaluk kaya Rabbi Yehuda af barishona." Okay, so there is a girsa that says Rabbi Yehuda disagreed even in the first case as well. So I will say, no, we'll stop over here for today. Shkoyach, good. We did really good today. Baruch Hashem, a lot of great Gemara, a lot of great cases, a lot of information. I will say Shkoyach. Hebron on Zoom, such as to see all of you this morning. Great to be back with all of you. Let's say Shkoyach.